So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is it's one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, where you had three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints. If we don't want to set it on a spaceship.
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music, and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther, but I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get in the game is the first line of the choral piece of music. But that actually went on to form the main theme of the music that I wrote. And I think for me it's really interesting about how things that you've written earlier, years before, sometimes come in really, really useful and fit. So I always tell people and students not to despair if something doesn't get used or doesn't work at the time, because actually there'll come a place or in a time where you think, hang on a minute, I've got something that fits. So in terms of that memorable theme, the Remember theme gets used in multitude of different ways during the game. And one of the things it does is helps you to identify the kind of psychic place that you're in the game. So the theme is played in lots of different ways, and actually you'll notice that as you go through the game, it becomes more and more broken and more manipulated and broken down as the player goes through the journey and as you're psychologically struggling to get to the end point in the game. So music's really, really useful for highlighting the psychological mood. And we talk a lot about psychogeography, which always sounds a bit pretentious, but actually I think it's really important to what the three of us did in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, maybe you want to talk a bit about that.
Like the core kind of idea about psychogeography, if you're not in, the place you're in is not the place you're in, or you create the place you're in. It's not just as you're here and then the landscape's out there, but you don't navigate like a city by street signs and by those kind of formal things. You navigate it by the things which are significant to you in the way that you've lived in that space. And I think that was really kind of key to, I think it's really central to how the fusion of art and story and music come together in Dear Esther, because it's not a place where we're going, right, we have to lead the player up here because it's a natural formation, and then you would naturally have a piece of music here because you come around a corner. But the story, music and art all work around the idea of what's going on in the narrator's head at this point. How do we represent his emotional state relative to this landscape? And again, it's that idea of the game is, it's a dream of a place. It's like the idea of it being a fever dream or a coma dream, which obviously ties in a lot with the kind of story, and we'll come back to in a lot more detail when we get to the caves a bit later on. So, Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about Walking Simulator?
You know what, I think I took offence to it when it first became a thing, but you know, I think I don't mind it so much now. I think the fact that we have kind of taken ownership over it, like that genre has been kind of made our own by not just our game, but like a bunch of different games have kind of embraced it. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other.
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple, everything is exposed and everything has to be exceptionally good for it to work, because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of framework, and that really means that every aspect of it has to be produced at a really high quality and has to be done with a lot of passion and a lot of thought. There's nowhere to hide in a game like Esther, and that's something which I think carries through to the best games of this type. You can see with all of them there's a real commitment to kind of depth and a really intelligent way of approaching design, and a real kind of trust in the player and a real assumption that players are smart, imaginative people who want experiences. It's not a game that it's easy to just knock off or to do with any kind of lazy attitude. You have to be really, really passionate and care a great deal and put an awful lot of thought into it if it's going to work.
So here it kind of, the environment becomes a little bit more surreal again. We kind of play with the colors a little bit, bring up the saturation. It's kind of a little bit of a return to some of the more cave-like aesthetics in terms of colors and stuff like that. And it's kind of there to kind of signpost another significant moment in the game, or something that's leading up to the significant moment. It goes back to this kind of idea of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious. And some of that emotional stuff comes through just through the colors of the environment, and the more saturated they are, the more kind of surreal things become. So this is kind of like a turning point in the game. It's kind of like the final notice of you reaching the end.
It was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced because it's two long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right, and quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end and that this is it, and that unlike where the rest of the island, there's this sense of this could just keep going on forever and ever and ever, and you're going to keep.
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other. So there was quite a lot of work that went into kind of building up this feeling of tension as you're rising and kind of making this moment as poignant as possible while still making it interesting. So a lot of effort was put into building up this weather, building up the wind and the swaying of the grass and kind of the volume of the soundscapes and everything mixing together with the music, and just kind of visually really trying to make this a tense moment. And I think it's hopefully been pulled off all right. And you'll notice when you get to the top, this kind of tension dies, and that's very purposeful. You'll see no more wind. It's just kind of like a symbolic thing where you're coming to the last moment, the point of no return, and that's been very deliberately designed that way.
We had a lot of debates, didn't we, about the ending of the game and whether the player should retain control or